So why are we bothering with this? Okay, so I suppose the aims and outcomes for today are to explore the key skills that can help us to work within diversity. Okay. Um, and also to discover how knowing ourselves, Philomena, going back to what you said, can help us to understand others. Okay, so knowing me, knowing you, this was a big thing at the NTE. We even had the ABBA picture up. Okay, knowing me, knowing you. And to explore key concepts such as invisible privilege, that may be something, that's a phrase you've heard, invisible privilege. We'll explore what we mean by that. Um, there are a couple of others. I didn't want to upset Beth by deciding to add even more slides to this. Okay, but there are a couple of other concepts that will pop up this morning. One is intersectionality. Okay, and another is othering. Okay, these are two words that you're going to hear me use. And I think often, especially those of us in the counselling community, we think people just know what we mean. Okay, but we'll look at those and explore those a little bit. And why are we going to do this? Well, so that we can work with couples, all of us here work with couples, okay? But also alongside one another in our relational organization, so that we can do that more confidently and competently, being more aware of the meanings made by others that may feed into their lives, choices, and relationships. Okay, so I don't know whether that feels like switching at the moment, but hopefully it will feel a bit clearer as we go through. And another reason is so that we can work, I mean, in a way, it touches on what I've just said, so that we can work relationally and respectfully. Okay. That we see everybody in their 360 degrees of wonderfulness. Okay. Um, and that we do that, we know the role that professional curiosity plays in that, but also the role that self-knowledge plays in that. Again, coming back to something that Philomena said. Okay. So usually we've done some introductions, which we often have, don't we, at the beginning of trainings? And I introduced myself really briefly, didn't I? You know, I'm Michelle. I just hope you all know who I am, which is a sort of strange situation, really. To be delivering to people who know who I am. So, what else might I say if I were delivering to people who perhaps didn't know who I was? I suppose in this context where I'm delivering something to you and we're essentially at work, I'd probably mention my professional identity. Okay, so I did say I'm head of relationship counselling at Marriage Care. I might mention that I'm a relationships counsellor. I might mention that I deliver training in relationships related matters. Yeah. When we introduce ourselves, as you just did, we tend to make it quite short. And so introductions um, tend to leave more questions than they answer, really. Yeah. Um, so, I mean, often, and it's something that we did in the tea break recently, when I'm delivering training, I might invite participants to share a fun fact about themselves. But I'm not going to ask you to do that today. What I'm going to do is invite you to guess a fun fact about me. Okay. Um, so I'm going to ask you a question, and I'm going to give you a moment to submit some guesses in the chat. Okay. And Beth, I can't see the chat, so you can tell me what comes up. Okay. So the question is, what kind of dancing do I do on a regular basis? Okay. Now, if you think you've heard this from anywhere else, no cheating. Okay. But if you don't know this, the answer to this, please submit some guesses in the chat. What kind of dancing do you think I do on a regular basis? I'll just give you a moment. Can we see any guesses yet, Beth?
No.
Oh, people really aren't sure. Go on, just go for it.
So Latin American, rumba, cha-cha-cha, tango.
Hey, lovely.
No.
Anything else? Yeah, coming up.
Oh, Penny said you've told us before.
Okay, right. Thank you, Penny.
Oh, zumba, bachata, or salsa.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So, but before I tell you the answer, then,
Ballet.
hello. Thank you. So before I tell you the answer, just reflect on why you made the guess you did. Okay. What did you base it on? Yeah. Because we're usually very good at constructing a whole life story for someone based on those initial short answers that we get in an introduction, aren't we? Yeah.
Okay, there's one more answer.
But
Think
what
of
is
something fun or unusual like belly dancing or something creative like salsa.
Thank you. Um, yeah, I mean, we get some quick answers in an introduction, and we then go away. We construct a whole story for somebody sometimes based on just that very small amount of information, don't we? As well as based on how they look. I don't know whether in your reflections you think, well, she looks like someone who might do Latin American dancing, or she look, I don't know. Or we might base it on how they dress, how they speak. Okay. So just notice how you feel when I tell you the answer now. Okay. The answer is Morris dancing. Okay. So just notice how you feel when you hear that answer. And ask yourself why you feel the way you feel. Yeah. So, I mean, I have to say as well, just to be fair to you, that I do love salsa as well. Okay. I like most types of dancing, really. Um, okay. So how might we include cultural information about ourselves when we introduce ourselves? Yeah. So I could say to you this morning, I could say, oh, hi, I'm Michelle. I'm head of relationship counselling at Marriage Care. I'm British of Irish and Caribbean heritage. Okay, so I could say that. I could make that my whole self-introduction. How much more do you feel you know about me now? Okay. And are you sure you know that about me? I think it was last autumn. I've got this lovely friend down here in Dorset where I live, white British friend. And she gifted me tickets to a literary event at which Kit Duvall, does anyone come across Kit Duvall? She wrote My Name is Leon. She was speaking at this event. Okay. Kit Duvall's parents, if you don't know, were of Irish and Black Caribbean heritage. Okay. And my friend was eager to know at the end of this session with her how much of her talk, which was about Kit Duvall's early life, how much of it had resonated with me. Okay. So she gifted me these tickets. There's somebody of Irish and Black Caribbean heritage coming to speak locally. You're going to love it because she's of the same heritage as you. And at the end of the talk, she said to me, so, she looked at me expectantly. Okay. And I didn't want to disappoint my friend because she'd done this out of the goodness of her heart. So I tried to find things because I kind of wanted to please her and not disappoint her. But the truth was that since my friend, this friend that I'm telling you about, has grown up in Birmingham, like Kit Duvall, she actually had far more in common with her than I did. Okay. Because the fact is that we're not just one thing, are we? Okay. Kit Duvall and I overlap on one thing to some extent. All right. So in conversation, she and I would realize that even that detail of having parents, Irish, Caribbean parents, that even that isn't the area of common experience that it might at first appear. Yeah. Our fathers are not from the same island. Yeah. And our mothers are not from the same region of Ireland, for example. But our identities are also informed by factors that may be very different. Yeah. So what I'm showing you here is something that many of you may have seen before, which is a diagram that's based on an acronym that John Burnham, who is a family therapist, created to try and represent all the different aspects of identity that we carry and that we have internally as well. Okay. So when you look at that, this full range of other possibilities, okay, you look at things like race, yes, sexual orientation, gender, I'm just picking them randomly, culture. Okay, Kit Duvall and I, you know, you can see there are so many areas here where we might be quite different. Okay. But to an outsider, that, you know, to my friend, looking at what she knew of my heritage, my ethnicity, decided that I would really feel like a kindred spirit to Kit Duvall. Okay. So this, again, I'm going to be saying it more than once today, but this is where we start to think about intersectionality. Okay. Because we aren't just one thing. We're lots of things. It's complex. And some of these things may loom larger or smaller in our lives, but they converge in a space here. I'm not quite sure what sort of color they'd make, where that makes us unique. Okay. But, you know, what would it be like if we included all of this whenever we introduced ourselves to other people? We'd never get anything else done, would we? We'd be here till sort of, I don't know, not just 5:30 today, but probably 5:30 this time next year. Okay. But even if we did include it, would it be the whole story? Okay. So we could add on, we could sort of say, well, actually, I could have said to my friend, well, actually, you know, Jill, you know, maybe I'm of Irish and Caribbean heritage, but I'm also a Catholic. Is Kit Duvall a Catholic? Actually, I think she probably was actually. I also look like this. Okay, I'm 5'4.5" and everything. You know, does Kit Duvall look like me? I could say that, but even then, would it be the whole story? So I'm going to invite you to do an exercise with me now. And as we do it, I'm just going to ask you to do it for yourselves. Okay, so you might like to have something to jot down. In fact, you will need pen and paper if you haven't already got it. Okay. And I'll be pausing at moments to give you time to reflect. Okay. So don't think I've frozen. Okay, if I pause, I'm just giving you time to jot things down. Okay. So what I'd like you to do, first of all, is to look at the diagram, okay, and you know, this is called the social graces because all these aspects of identity, it kind of matches. We've got 2 G's, gender, geography, and then we've got a couple of R's, race, religion, lots of A's, age, ability, appearance, a couple more C's, class, culture. Then we've got the E's in graces, ethnicity, education, you know, what sort of education did you have? How long were you in education for? Employment. And then 3 S's, sexuality, sexual orientation, and spirituality. Okay. So I'd like to invite you to choose just one of those areas. Okay. And think how you would define yourself in relation to that. Okay. So for example, if I choose ethnicity, I might write, I am a British born and bred daughter of an Irish mother and a Trinidadian father. Or if I choose sexual orientation, I might write, I am heterosexual. Okay, so just a statement about yourself in relation to just one of these aspects of identity, if you can just jot that down. Okay, and when you've written that, if you can then after it write, and that means, okay? And follow that with any impact you can think of that has had on you and your life, whether small or great. So, for example, I might follow my ethnicity with, and that means that I have crazy hair. Okay, so I've got a sentence so far that says I'm a British born and bred daughter of an Irish mother and a Trinidadian father, and that means that I have crazy hair. Okay. So again, I'll give you a moment to do that. Something that your first statement means in your life. And then following that impact that you've just written, I hope I'm giving you enough time to do this. If you could just write, and that means again. Okay, so it's almost a bit like consequences, isn't it? So I might now write, and that means that it took me a long time to appreciate my hair. Okay, so if you can think of it and something that the first impact that now that's had, what has that meant? And what does that continue to mean? And I'm going to pause for a further minute now to allow you to add as many more and that means as you can to keep going with and that means. Okay. So if you would like to, please type into the chat how it felt for you to do that exercise. Only if you would like to. And Beth, you can tell me whether there's anything in a moment. But just to share, for me, I think first of all, what we've been saying is that we're multifaceted. When we look at this diagram, we are multifaceted, aren't we, as human beings? We have intersectionality. Yeah. But that, when I said to you, well, would it tell us if we could include all this in our self-introductions, would it tell us everything? Would it tell somebody else everything about us? The answer is no, because I don't know what anyone's going to say in the chat if you feel moved to do so, but what you've just done is you've thickened your narrative. Okay. which might sound a bit opaque. I don't know if any of you have done any systemic training or family, because I work with families as well, or I did before I did this job, which is far too busy for me to have any clients now. But Michael White was a theorist in family therapy. And he talks about thickening the narrative. In other words, that we don't just take the thin line of someone's story. We're curious enough to ask in and around that. Okay, what else and what else and what else, and the meaning of that. So yes, if we're genuinely going to be open to others, and want to deepen our understanding of them, it might not be enough to know that their mother was Irish. Okay. What might be more instructive is to understand what that has meant and continues to mean to them. Because it might not be the same for me as it is for Kit Duval or anybody else here who has an Irish mother. Okay. Beth, was anything in the chat? Any responses in the chat?
More awareness, bigger picture, values, what's important to me.
Thank you. I feel quite moved by those responses, actually. And I wonder whether anyone was surprised by anything as they did it. Again, you can pop that into the chat if you want to. Okay, so let's think then about what we mean by intercultural working. You know, what are the ingredients that we need for intercultural working that's competent, respectful, and safe? And I've got a few books here actually. So I'm just reaching across for one of them and grab it without making the others fall down. Oh no, that's the wrong one. Yes, I did use quite a bit of this book here, which is Race, Culture and Counselling, The Ongoing Challenge. Oh no, that's not the right one. I did use this one, but there's another one by Rini Singh. I've forgotten to bring it downstairs. And I'll be talking about her a little bit in this. But she wrote a book also called Race and Culture, and it's called Tools, Techniques and Trainings. Okay, so it's especially for our purposes, really. And what she talks about is cultural competence, and these are the ingredients that she feels cultural competence consists of: cultural sensitivity, cultural humility, self-knowledge and awareness, which you're all beginning to talk about now, okay, and curiosity. And she identifies those as key ingredients. So that might surprise you, really. Or it might not. I think things have moved on quite a lot, but I think certainly when I was at school, you know, I think in an attempt to be culturally competent, the teachers who worked with us, you know, would just try to impart bits of knowledge about our culture to show themselves as, well, I know that about you. Okay. So I don't know, it might be, Kasia, I happen to know that you're Polish background, aren't you? You know, it'd be a bit like somebody turning up to your work in one of those lovely Polish dancing outfits, okay, and saying to you, well, I thought I'd wear this today because you're Polish. Okay, all right, which is a really lovely gesture. Okay, and Kasia, just to say, I had the opportunity to learn some of that dancing actually at school, because I think if you go to a Catholic school, you're actually a little bit of everything that's there, aren't you? So I feel a little bit Polish because there are lots of Polish girls there too. But you know, it might be nice and it's enjoyable, but there are a lot more things here, aren't there, than that, I think. Okay, and we'll dig into what those are. And I don't think as marriage care, I mean, I know we're trying to grip this seriously, okay, as many organizations are. Equality, diversity, inclusion, they're quite buzzwords at the moment, aren't they? Everyone's doing equality, diversity, and inclusion, okay? And so as we try to do that, we grapple with what do we mean, okay? And what do we mean by cultural competence? And there are some differences in what people come up with, but I think there's significant overlap. I think most people are saying it looks like attitudes, skills, and knowledge. Okay, it's more than being respectful of the cultures represented in our service or the community. Okay, it's more than putting on a Polish day, lovely as that is, or putting on a Diwali assembly, lovely as that is. It's more than that. Yeah, it's also, again, as Philomena sort of hinted at really earlier, it means being aware of our own worldview, yeah, including our own culture and biases. We all have biases that are unconscious. We don't know, that means we're not aware that we have them. Yeah. In all sorts of directions. So again, thinking about that big circle, all those aspects of identity. I told a story to some people, you may have heard this before, where I was working with a family, quite, fairly low socioeconomic status, quite complex, substance misuse in the mix. And they had children and they came along for a session. And I said to them, we had a kind of a ribbony thing out on the floor. And I was thinking about their future, and I was saying, okay, so what are your hopes for your children? And they didn't even miss a beat in telling me that they wanted their children to go to university. Okay. And when they told me that, I felt something clunk inside me. And that clunk was the realization of an unconscious bias that I'd been holding. I didn't think they were going to say that. There's something about their profile and the meaning I was making that meant that I didn't expect them to have that kind of ambition for their children. So that's just an example. Sometimes it takes something to happen for us to realize that we're holding an unconscious bias. So this can feel quite tender to people. We can feel as though we're being told that we're something ist when we really don't think we are. Intellectually here, we don't think we are that thing. But we may have attitudes, and it's not because we're willfully bad or willfully hating of people. It's just because of lots of things. Okay, probably going back to that John Burnham diagram. Okay, that's brought us to the place that we are. It might also be about privilege, but we'll talk about that a bit later. Okay, cultural competence means developing positive attitudes towards cultural differences as well. And it does mean gaining knowledge of different cultural practices and worldviews, okay, and developing skills for communication and interaction across cultures, okay. So we see here, I mean, I've talked about, putting on a Polish dancing costume or doing a Diwali assembly. That's the sort of thing that might emerge out of gaining knowledge of different cultural practices. So we can see that if we're going to be culturally competent, we do need to do that. Okay, it is responsible to take an interest and to educate ourselves about different cultures. But this can be a difficult task when many cultures are represented in a community as they are here. Okay. What does it not look like? Okay. I think I don't know whether you feel the same, but I know with other people that I've worked with, there can be concern that there can be a conflict of interest when we're trying to be positive or open-minded or sensitive to cultural beliefs that might differ from the majority or from our own, especially if we're seeing behaviour that gives rise to safeguarding or child protection concerns, yeah, or even breaks the law in the country of residence. So we have to navigate, we have to do a dance between meeting our statutory obligations, but also being respectful and enabling of people by taking that trouble to journey into their space to understand why it is they may see things the way they do. Okay. So going back to Rini Singh, because I find what she says about this to be helpful, she talks about distinguishing between the domain of production. Again, those of you who are experienced counsellors will probably have come across these terms. A domain of production, where sometimes in counselling, it's a bit like, if you had a safeguarding concern in counselling, you shift, don't you, into a different space. Okay, because you go into the domestic abuse protocol, for example. You're doing something different. You're not counselling now. Okay, you're meeting your statutory duties. Okay. And the domain of explanation, which is where we do have exploratory conversations with people about why they are where they are, why they're behaving the way they're behaving. We need to distinguish between those, but ideally, as counsellors, and I can say it because we're all counsellors here today, we do need to work from both at the same time in this situation. And this approach helps us to move between considering aspects of behaviour, for example, child chastisement. I had a family where the the mother's cultural heritage meant that she thought it was okay to throw shoes at her daughter as punishment. Okay, she thought that was okay. So it was important for me to explore the accompanying beliefs around that behaviour at the same time as being able to hold my statutory duty to say, okay, but we need also to understand that we can't do that here. Okay. Again, going back to Rini Singh, I think she puts it well. She says, exploring parents' own cultural and racial beliefs regarding child rearing does not mean that we let go of our statutory duty with regard to child protection. However, what it does enable is that a respectful, curious conversation can take place that acknowledges closely held cultural beliefs, without which families and individuals may find it difficult to change. Yeah. So, I mean, having said all of that, of course, the safety of children and women should be the highest context marker and does come first for us. Culture cannot excuse abuse. But this does not mean that we need to silence or subjugate other ideas and stories. And sometimes crises can present people with opportunities for change, and beliefs can be a valuable resource for us to work with rather than against. I don't know, that's quite a lot there that I've said. I don't know if there's anything that's come up for anybody there, any questions. If so, just put them in the chat and Beth will tell me what they are. Okay, but I'll push on. Okay, even if you do have questions. Does anyone know who this is? Quite a while ago, Smiley Culture. He's only there because he's got culture in his name. That's the only reason I've got him there. But he was quite funny. He died recently, actually, didn't he? But his lyric, they're quite hard to understand, but quite funny lyrics about living in the UK as a black man of Jamaican extraction. So we saw, didn't we, in that cultural competence that we do need to learn about the cultures of the people that we support or work with, and that that cultural competence asks that we have knowledge. Yeah, but how do we do this? I mean, if you reflect for a moment on just a few people that you know or work with, what cultural heritage is represented amongst that group? I mean, even if we think this morning, looking at you all here, I happen to know many of you. Okay, so I know that there's quite a lot of cultural heritage represented in our session this morning. Yeah. What languages are spoken? By the way, if anyone knows anyone in marriage care who can speak Cantonese, please let me know. What languages are spoken? I don't know if you know that in our multicultural society here in Britain, there are 17 ethnic groups. And of course, if you live in the more metropolitan areas and London, the members of those groups are represented in higher numbers. Okay, so it makes it look as though actually there are more people from diverse ethnic groups than there are actually in our society if you live in one of those areas. But it's 17. So how can we possibly acquire all the knowledge about every community present here if we know that anyone from any of those communities might turn up in our counselling room? Well, there are people who've tried to pin down and formalize and make available this kind of information. And an example is culturegrams, which is something that was developed in the United States by the David M. Kennedy Center. And it's a database of unique cultural content written and reviewed by in-country experts. There are 25 categories that include customs, traditions, politics. There's a kids edition. It really is quite thorough. Okay, and I'll just give you an example of a page here. This one here, this is one that's about India, and you can see it's not a very clear slide, but you can see that there are some fun facts here about India, like how do you say happy birthday in Hindi? Okay, and you can even play it so you can hear how it sounds. If you look on the left here, you can see that there's information about the land and history and religion and so on. Okay, so lots of information, probably be really useful if you're putting on an assembly. Okay, but what's missing here? What are the limitations?
The voice of the actual people.
Thank you, Janine. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, what are the dangers possibly then? If we use this as our source and think, okay, now we know, Is there a danger in that? You know, as Janine says, we're not hearing the actual people. Yeah. So our attempts to become culturally literate could lead to an assumption of sameness within a culture, couldn't it? Okay. This I've got so many stories, but a friend of mine, her daughter works for in this country. Her boss is from the Asian subcontinent. I don't know exactly where. Okay. And they were having a meeting with some people from America who were coming over. And when they came across and they met her boss, the American people said to her, "We thought you'd be in traditional dress." Okay. They'd probably done their homework on culturegrams. Okay. But what's missing, as Janine says, is the voice of the individual people, isn't it? Okay. What can you see here? What would you call this? Carmel, are you still there? I can't see everybody. Can you see? Is Carmel still with us? Maybe not, because I can't hear from her. How about Philomena?
Yeah, is it a full English breakfast?
Yeah, thank you. That's what we
At the
call
greasy spoon.
full English. Philomena, is this what you had for breakfast this morning?
No, unfortunately, no.
But it's a full English. Okay.
Yes.
It's the traditional English breakfast.
For lorry drivers at the greasy spoon, I'm sure.
I don't know, did anyone else have this for breakfast this morning? Here we are, all in England this morning, and not one of us had this for breakfast. Yeah. I bet this is on culturegrams though. I don't know, I haven't had a look, okay? But what else would need to be understood to know what I or we as British people do about breakfast? Okay, just have a think about that. What else would we need to understand? Thank you. Tea.
Just what people enjoy to eat, you know, what sort of diets they can or can't consume as well.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And that just because you live in England doesn't mean that you are English, that you would want this type of breakfast.
Yeah, yeah. And that's just touching the tip of the iceberg, isn't it? There are lots of things to understand. You might be vegan, okay? or vegetarian. Okay, there is so much to understand what we as individuals, as Janine says, you know, our individual voices on this. Okay. So how realistic is it to think that there could be a single method of acquiring knowledge of cultures, as interesting as it would be, but would it be satisfactory in generating the range, the depth, the subtlety of understanding that's actually called for if we're to work with people in a meaningful way? So what is culture? Okay, time for some definitions, and it's actually extremely complex. Yeah. According to Raymond Williams, who wrote a book quite a while ago now, about 40 years ago, a book called Keywords, the word culture is one of the 2 or 3 most complicated words in the English language. But let's consider some of the things that it might be. Okay. So this is just looking at things that people have said in the past. Okay. Pierre Bourdieu, a French sociologist, wrote this in 1976, that culture is a common set of previously assimilated master plans from which, by an act of invention, an infinite number of individual patterns directly applicable to specific situations are generated. It's quite wordy, but really it's what you just said. Okay, that there may be a basic truth, okay, the French breakfast, I was going to say, traditional English breakfast, but we know that there are loads of variations on that theme, okay, according to specific situations and individual patterns, okay. Ruth Benedict, writing even longer ago, said, no culture yet observed has been able to eradicate the differences in the temperaments of the persons who compose it. It's always a give and take. And I think that sits nicely with Colin Largo, book I showed you a moment ago, who talks about the dynamic interplay between personality and culture, and that removes any possibility for simplistic predictions of others' behavior and any assumptions about what they believe, think, what their guiding constructs are, and so on. So, you know, what does this mean for the possibility of doing useful work with people who superficially seem culturally different from ourselves? Yeah. I mean, Colin Largo also reflects that because of this, because as counsellors, we need to be curious anyway. We mustn't be making assumptions. Really, as long as we're open and curious and have self-awareness, we can work with anybody. Yeah, if we embrace all those conditions that everyone learns it when they're doing their training, those core conditions, and particularly curiosity, we can work with anybody. And Colin Largo says this, you know, he reflects on how, therefore, if you're able to take this on board, it's possible to do successful work with clients, even if they're not of the same culture. Okay. Difference and culture are often used interchangeably to try and communicate the same thing. Colin Largo also tries to unpick this. Okay. So he says that difference is often visible and it might make us make assumptions. Okay. So if you think back to my friend's daughter, the colleagues from America, they looked, they saw one thing and they built a story, a bit like we were saying at the very beginning, a bit like my dancing. Okay. They built a story based on very limited information. Yeah. But culture, it might take on visible expression sometimes, but really it's about what's inside. Okay. So therefore what we hear rather than what we see is important. And we're not going to hear it if we don't ask about it, are we? If we don't take that moment to be curious. Okay, to hear the individual voices, as Janine said. Okay. Okay, I think we've arrived at a tea break early. So we'd allowed just a 10-minute break here. So should we, is it just gone 10 past, Beth? Can you see? Yeah. Should we come back?
12 minutes past.
Yeah. Should we come back at 25 past then? Does that feel comfortable for people to go and dose up on the drugs? Those people aren't feeling very well and have a stretch and the rest of it. Okay. But thanks for still being here. So we'll see you at 25 past. Okay. Okay, Beth, let's just take a quick break. All right. Okay. You're right, Janine.
Yeah, I've just had 2 paracetamols.
I think it was something I hope it wasn't something from the centre.
I don't know. I thought it was hay fever at the weekend because it was a tickly cough. But it wiped me out on Monday. Yeah, I don't know what it is. Just some horrible bug.
I think Tom wasn't feeling too well as we flew back.
Well, so Tom was coughing, Bridget was coughing, and I was coughing, but I did think it's probably hay fever. But it's definitely not hay fever.
Yeah. Well, I hope you're feeling better properly. So what I'm going to ask you to do now is to think of a time when you felt different. Okay. And this is something that I've pinched from Janine. I know she pinched it from a book as well. So I thought it was such a powerful exercise. So I thought it'd be really useful to do it in this training, to be reflecting on difference. So I'm going to give you an example of, I mean, I could come up with loads actually, but I'll give you an example of a time when I felt different, just so you can see what it is I'm asking you to do. And I suppose I'm going to be following this kind of process. So thinking, well, what was happening? Well, in this particular instance, what was happening was that someone was speaking to me about something they weren't very happy about, that's work related. Okay. So they were speaking to me. I assume they were speaking to me about it because of the role I have in marriage care. Okay. So I suppose that puts me in a slightly different position, doesn't it? So this is something that speaks to my identity here in terms of employment, you know, my role. Okay, it was this aspect of my identity that this person, if you like, was seeing. Okay, and interacting with. And what I was thinking was, while this was happening, was I was thinking, well, it sort of overlaps a bit with how I was feeling. I'm trying to separate the thoughts and feelings, but I was thinking, I'm not getting a chance to say anything here. I was thinking that. I was thinking, I wonder what this person wants me to do. Okay. And I was feeling unheard, but I was also feeling unseen, because I felt that because the person was speaking to one aspect of my identity, I didn't feel that they could see that I also have all these other bits and pieces too. Okay. That I'm, you know, that I have family, or I have spirituality, I have beliefs, I have I don't know, I might have some concerns, worries that emerge out of some of these other aspects of my identity. I felt that it was quite a one-dimensional experience where someone was just engaging with one aspect of my identity. And I did say earlier that, you know, when we think about some of these terms that we hear sometimes when we're talking about diversity, we hear invisible privilege, we hear intersectionality, and we also hear about othering. And I think that's how I felt. I felt othered. Okay. What does that mean? Well, I think what othering is when you strip people of their humanity, really. You boil them down to the thing that is most obvious to you. Okay. So in that instance, it was, I am who I am within this organization. Okay. In other situations, it might be that you are who you are based on your skin color, or based on, you know, whether you look old or young, or whether you're one person's idea of attractive or not, or whether you've, you know, whether you've got a PhD, or whether you've got one GCSE or whatever. Okay. So I think if you strip someone down and back to just one aspect, it enables you to interact with them in a way that isn't almost fully human. Yeah. I recently read The Tattooist of Auschwitz. I don't know if anyone else has read this book. It's okay. We know the story, but it's actually based on a true story. And when I was reading the novel, I was quite struck by, you know, when they talk about the people in the concentration camp in Auschwitz, how if the guards wanted to be able to use some of the female prisoners, they didn't cut their hair. Okay, they kept their hair long. Okay, and it made me reflect that whole process that we're only too familiar with about what happened during you know, the Nazi occupation in Germany. You know, that the whole process of making people wear a star if they are of a particular faith, then taking away all their belongings, making them all wear the same thing, removing their hair, all the better to not see them as people. And when they needed to see them as people, they did other things like allowed them to keep their hair and that sort of thing. So I suppose that's how I felt in this interaction, was that I'd been stripped of everything else that makes me who I am, and that someone was engaging with me only on one aspect of my identity. Okay. So that's just to give you an example of how you might think about it, as I'm going to ask you to do now. So we're going to use the breakout rooms just so that you can have slightly more intimate discussions. So I think, what have we got then, Beth? Is it 1 of 3 and 1 of 2?
Well, as Carmel said, she wouldn't be able to join us. We've just got 2 rooms with 2. Unless
Okay, I'm going to go now as well. So thank you very much, everybody.
Is that Carmel?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Carmel.
Okay,
Bye,
thank you.
Carmel.
Thank you.
Okay, well, what might be better then, Beth, I'm thinking, is if we create a breakout room that's just for all the 4 of you to go into, so that you can have the discussion without Beth and me being present in discussion. So if you can organise that, Beth. And we're just going to give you, maybe because it's 4 of you, maybe 20 minutes to just talk about this. So you might want to take a photo of this screen. Janine, you've probably got it in your head anyway, so you'd be able to do it in the group. To just think about this, and then when you come back, maybe just to share how it felt to do this. Okay. So all of you are going together 20 minutes. So we'll be back at about 10 to 11, Beth.
Okay, yes.
Okay. I hope that feels okay for everybody. Okay.
Oh, what a shame, Penelope. We didn't hear the end of your story.
Okay, it doesn't matter, but it was uncomfortable. It eventually resolved.
Yeah.
Okay. So I don't know whether you want to, I mean, obviously you can use the chat if you want to, but there's so few of you now that we could just speak it. Does anybody want to share just how it felt to do that exercise?
Really insightful, because I know when I was talking about my situation, so how I felt, what I was thinking, what I was feeling, that was good. But what was more useful is actually when I was listening to the others, and you know, just feeling their pain when they were going through it, you know, when they were experiencing what they were experiencing, and hearing them describe it just makes you really think. Just makes you really think. Yeah.
Thank you, Philomena. Thank you. Anyone else want to share how it felt? But of course you don't have to.
It's definitely good to hear that everyone has this type of experience.
Yeah.
It's not only us.
Yeah. Thanks, Kasia. Thank you.
And how out of just not being aware, we can do that to other people. We can, you know, make people feel uncomfortable or embarrassed or whatever, just from not really paying attention to what's going on.
Yeah.
I think if you feel unincluded in a group, it's that awful feeling of shame. For me, it is always a terrible feeling of shame and discomfort.
Yes. a feeling of belonging is so important, isn't it, for our well-being? And as you say, Penny, you know, it can be so uncomfortable and feeling and shaming to feel somehow that you don't, for whatever reason that might be. Yeah.
And when you might be thinking that you've kind of learned how to be with the group, how to belong, and then something just hits you that that brings up, I'm not the same. I have got a different experience. I think that can be quite a visceral feeling, you know, of,
yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Also, the same, even though we were different, now reflecting back on it, I don't think it's necessarily on us that we're different, or that we feel like that, or we have that opinion, or we didn't grow up in that environment, or, you know, whatever it was. I just think it just really makes me think that when I'm around other people who may be feeling different, and how I can be more in tune with them and more focused on trying to make them feel more comfortable about being part of that group. I think this is what's made me, it's opened my eyes to that a little bit more, I think.
Yes, and I mean, of course, there are times when we're well in, as they say in my part of the world. And so we know how that feels as well. And we don't know how it might be a shock to us to realize that there are people who are feeling kind of on the outside of that, or that they don't understand the code, if you like, for being part of that well-in group sort of thing. Understand the codes. That's something, something that sits with me, that idea of that was just not understanding. You may as well be speaking a different language. Yeah, well, it sounds like you had a really rich discussion. I'm sure it's something you'll go on thinking about. So thank you. And thank you for your generosity in feeling able to share in that group as well. And you know, I don't know whether, I'm not going to ask you to share your stories now, but you know, it's interesting to reflect, isn't it, on you know, which areas the experience you shared, which areas on here did it speak to, you know. So I you know, I think a lot of people perhaps would look at me and expect me to share a story of feeling different that's something to do with how I look and my ethnicity. And I do have stories like that, but I have stories from other aspects of my identity as well, and I tried to share something a bit different with you, perhaps something that you might not have been expecting. Yeah. Just to show that you know, we might feel different in different ways in relation to different aspects of our identity at different times, and definitely in relation to who we're with and where we are. Yeah, so you might be more aware of a difference somewhere, and then you go somewhere else, and that doesn't loom at all. But there's something else. Yeah, we can use this. We can use how we felt moved by that with our clients. Yeah, to getting into their experience.
Michelle, I've got an example of that, of it shifting. So my husband's business is training gas fitters, so it's mainly male. And I worked in the office, I did the admin, so used to it just being all male apart from me. And quite comfortable in that, never thought about it. But go somewhere else where it's all male, and I feel quite uncomfortable. And so that is kind of the difference of the intersections of my role in my husband's business.
Yes.
Kind of giving me a sense of why I'm there and what I'm doing, and feeling my place is good. And yet in another environment, really being shut down by the fact that it's all male. You know, you can't kind of get in or things like that. So that just come to me looking at the Gracies, thinking, oh yeah.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Thank you, Janine. Yeah. So I mean, I hope you're not thinking this, but you might be thinking, you know, how is any of this relevant to, you know, the questions that we had, you know, sort of how we can work across cultural boundaries and so on. And I don't suppose this will surprise you, this the word that I'm going to come up with now. I mean, I've got Alice in Wonderland on here because what was it she kept saying as she was wandering around Wonderland? As she encountered things? Anyone remember?
Curiouser and curiouser.
Absolutely. Okay, so it's just keeping, to me, that's such an important word, that curiosity, and it is something that everyone says about cultural competence, that we need to be curious, and then we need to be curious again, and then we need to never stop being curious and not think we know. Yeah. And also self-knowledge. Okay, it's the other thing that can help us, and that's what you've just been doing. And I think you've already seen, even though it's in a very short time, in reflecting on your own experience, how that can then help you to turn that around and back towards someone else. Okay, being able to sort of think, okay, yeah, okay, that's what it can be like. You know, I know what that's like. I've experienced that, not knowing the rules, not knowing the code, not feeling I belong, not feeling understood. So maybe I can begin to get into the experience of the person who's sitting with me. Yeah. And what we mean by self-knowledge, you know, is our understanding also of how we are influenced, yes, but also how we are influencing each other. Yeah, I wouldn't like to think that I would just sit in that space of, oh, you know, everyone's making me feel like this. Okay. I don't think that's helpful for our clients either. Okay, it's also, okay, so where are you in this story? What part do you play? So self-knowledge, thinking what impact our personal experiences have on our work. Yeah, I'm sure all of you will have discussed this, some of you more recently than others. If you're CRC trainees, you'll be thinking about this all the time. When we get a bit more dyed in the wool, we might forget sometimes to think about that. Yeah. How does our work and those with whom we work impact us? Yeah, you know, different clients. Are you the same with every client, for example? And also an awareness of our own racial and cultural backgrounds, if we're thinking about diversity, you know, and how this enhances or constrains our work with people from similar or dissimilar groups. I think similar groups, we need to really think about that, because we can be a bit less curious if we think we imagine someone's the same as us. Yeah. So we need this curiosity with everybody. And you know, when I was first asked to write this training, actually, I said to the person who asked me, I said, well, you know, actually, I think every couple is intercultural, whatever their ethnicity, that, you know, because we're not the same. Okay, you might both have been born in London. My husband and I were both born in London, but what about when? Yeah, what about our you know, our stories running up to our arrival in the world? Also all the layers, all the things that we can see in John Burnham's diagram. So we're definitely not the same, me and my husband, even though we were both born in London. Okay. So self-knowledge helps us to be culturally sensitive. Going back to Rini Singh, she describes this as an attempt to be receptive and responsive to the thoughts and feelings associated with one's own and other people's cultural background. Okay. It's where we situate ourselves informs how we think about others as well, others who are like us and others who are different. Okay, so if I think that's about that person over there who has lots of tattoos, that relates to where do I see myself? What's my value system? Where am I? And what part does that play in where I'm positioning them? Okay, a bit like the family I told you about. That was definitely in the mix, you know. So part of self-knowledge is recognizing this and taking the trouble to look into ourselves, which we are used to doing as counsellors. Yeah. But it's also part of engaging with equality, diversity, and inclusion. I think this diagram is really useful. This image is really useful. Okay, thinking about the concept of culture as an iceberg. I know we use an iceberg for other things too in counselling. Okay, but we can apply it to culture as well, because I think that in using our curiosity and our self-knowledge, we're trying to go beneath this waterline, okay? We can see what we can see at the top, okay? Again, like the example I gave you earlier, the person from America who expected somebody to be dressed traditionally. Sort of surface culture, I see you, I expect this, okay? And as I say, these are often the things that are attended to in organizations or institutions who are trying to be more culturally diverse. Oh, well, we've got children here who are, you know, Muslim or Hindi or whatever it happens to be, and therefore we're going to do this, and we're going to have this festival, and we're going to do that, and so on. But there'll be aspects of that culture that are less obvious to us beneath the waterline, and they're perhaps more embedded in responses, in attitudes, and that takes a bit more work to get to understand. Yeah. So if we're trying to have a genuine cultural competence in the way we work, we are going to have to think about how we can begin to make the invisible visible. Yeah. That those culturograms that I saw you earlier, that was like a cognitive function, wasn't it? Understanding cultural differences. But really, to be able to get to this bit here, we're going to need to use that curiosity so that we can have good quality conversations which stay away from assumptions. Yeah. Again, curiosity. So I'm not going to linger on this, but I think that our the baggage concept that we use in our marriage preparation in marriage care probably comes from this, okay? And this is really, I mean, I'm not going to spend a long time on it, as I say, but it just shows how important it is to understand perhaps what we've got, what stuff we bring with us into relationship, okay? Because that stuff can influence the way that we're able to communicate in relationship. Okay, so I've taken this image, which is from a different relationship toolkit, that people use sometimes to support couples to explore that. Okay, so I mean, if you look at this, so you've got in the green, it's enduring vulnerabilities. I would add strengths in there as well, enduring strengths and vulnerabilities. Okay, and then we've got the orange box, which is stressful events, and the pink box, which is adaptive processes, which is how we behave, how we talk, how we communicate, what we do, and that is informed by the stuff we bring with us and also what's going on for us or what has gone on for us. Okay. So if you think about everything that we've been talking about, and if you think about that iceberg concept of culture, which box would that be in? Any thoughts on that?
I'm just wondering if Beth could make the shared screen a little bit bigger. I can't. I've only got a small element of it.
Oh, have you?
Yeah, it was bigger last time, but now we've come back. I've got all of us bigger. Maybe it's my view. Okay.
I think you ought to have a focus on contents option in your Zoom, Philomena.
Oh, right. Okay. Focus on contents. Is that in the view? Oh, hold on. Maybe it's
Whenever I can't see my Zoom things as clearly. Beth, are you there? Are you able to help?
We'll just have a look.
I mean, it's not. I mean, if it's the small writing you're trying to see, that's not, I don't think that's very clear anyway. Okay.
Oh, right. Okay.
But
Okay.
the enduring vulnerabilities, that says the stuff we bring with us, and then
Right.
stressful events is things as it happens. Sorry, I'm checking that says now stressful stuff happens, and then the pink one is just how we communicate and resolve.
Right.
So, you know, I think, you know, the stuff we bring with us, I think all that stuff, that those attitudes, that stuff beneath the waterline, that cultural iceberg, would be in that green box. Okay. But it's not right in our awareness all the time. Okay. So for example, I gave this example at the NTE. I'm a Catholic, but my husband is an Anglican. Okay. And he likes me to go to his church sometimes. Okay. And so on, you know, in terms of appearances, it looks the same, doesn't it? It's a church. Okay, you go in, there are pews, all the rest of it. People are, you know. But I don't feel at home in that church, really. Okay. And it's not because anyone's doing anything wrong. I know people there, they're very friendly and so on. It's just because in my iceberg, the hidden bit of my culture, probably, if I stop to think about it, it's silly little things like, for example, when you have the news sheet and you're asking to pray for people, for example, people that are sick. In my church, the names are things like Miska or Mullane or Palazzo or, okay. Whereas in his church, it's Smith, White, Thompson. Okay. Now that's silly, isn't it? That's just silly. But it's just kind of, I just feel that this is more familiar to me. Because why? Well, because I suppose that's what I grew up with. Yeah. So, but it takes a little bit of digging to work out. Also, in his church, they have flags, you know, like the Union Jack and that sort of thing. I find that quite difficult because we don't have that in the Catholic Church, do we? Okay, but it's not that someone's done something wrong. It's just because of my cultural heritage, yeah, and where I feel I belong. But I suppose that it doesn't happen, but it could happen, couldn't it? That in the way I communicate with my partner, it could create conflict. Okay, because he might be like, oh, well, you're saying that your church is better than my church. No, well, my church, yeah, it could create conflict, but actually what's feeding into that conflict is something that is well, Janine used the word visceral earlier on, and it's just something that is in me that is just part of my cultural story. It's not really a cognitive thing. So I suppose that's what we're getting to. So you can see here that I'm inviting you to think about a time recently when you weren't at your best and to think about how you would complete this diagram. So there might be something that happened. It might have happened this morning. It might have happened last week. And something that was happening that meant that you were either in a bit of a strop or you had an argument or whatever, you know, and you'd be putting that in the pink box. And then, and also to put in that pink box, well, what were you doing or saying in that situation? And then to think, what stressors were exacerbating things? So you might put that in the orange box. Okay. So Janine, it might be, you know, well, I was a bit ratty with my husband yesterday. And actually the stressor was wasn't feeling very well and I've had a busy weekend. Yeah. And then to think, well, did the way that you behave generate more stress? Okay. And to add that in. Did the additional stress have a further impact on how you were behaving? And then to go back up into the green box, what beliefs or previous experiences fed into the stress and how you responded? Okay. So if I use that example of the church, then what are the beliefs and previous experiences? Well, I suppose previous experiences are that I was brought up in the Catholic Church and it was a very multicultural experience because it was a Catholic church in London and all that sort of thing. And that in its way feeds into 2024 when I'm having a discussion with my husband about which church we're going to on Sunday. Does that kind of make sense? Because I'm going to ask you to do that in pairs now. Okay. I'm going to ask you to have a think about something that went on in the pink box. To think about basically what you think might have fed it in terms of stresses in the here and now, but also in terms of your story. Okay. And you won't have very long because it's almost something you could do in counselling over quite a few sessions, this, isn't it? But just have a little go at it. Okay. So we're going to put you into breakout rooms again, but this time in pairs. You might want to take a picture of this, okay, because you won't be able to see it because there's quite a lot to remember there, or to jot down some of the questions. And then Beth's going to put you into breakout rooms for 15 minutes. So we'll come back it's 11:12 now. So if we come back just before 11:30, Beth, if that's all right. say 11:28. My maths right? Okay, enjoy the discussion. See you in a moment. Hey, they all okay, Beth? Okay, great. Welcome back. Philomena back as well. I can't see everybody. Okay, great. Okay, I mean, unless you want to share anything that's emerged for you from that, I'm not going to ask you about to share. You're welcome to type anything into the chat if you think there's something be interesting for everyone to see. But I think, you know, when we think about working with couples, you know, communication is the number one reason they come to us. Okay, and stress plays a major part in communication difficulties. And I think to be able to explore anyway, as I'm sure you all do, what might feed into that, what beliefs, what previous experiences might be feeding into that dynamic, I think could be really illuminating for couples. Let's add curiosity about aspects of identity into that, you know, and what parts they may be playing. Okay, thank you. Beth, you can tell me if anything comes up in the chat. Okay, so here's a name we can try and guess how to pronounce. It's a Dutch name. Geert Hofstede. He was a Dutch social psychologist. Okay, and he tried to pin down the cultural elements that we saw beneath the water level in that cultural iceberg. Okay, so you know the culturegrams, as we've said, they might describe the visual things, the things above the waterline. But what he was looking at, and he did this pretty successfully actually, was to see if he could create overarching descriptions, not of national dress or national foods, but of national attitudes and feelings, and to see whether he could categorize countries accordingly. Okay. So just put your seatbelts on because this can feel a little bit whizzy, but I'm not going to go into it in too much detail, okay? But what he did is he originally he identified these 4 dimensions, okay, in terms of attitudes. So there's power distance, okay, and that was about whether people in a society or in a culture expect to have a lot of power or not very much power. Okay, so you've got to remember with these is that there are 2 extremes, okay? So you might be in a culture or a society where you expect no agency, no power whatsoever, or you might be in a culture or a society where you expect everything to be really equal in terms of power, okay? They're the extremes, but then there's the continuum between them, okay? So he identified that cultures and countries could be situated at each extreme or anywhere along that spectrum, okay? And it's the same with these other attitudes. Uncertainty avoidance, that's the level to which you can live with uncertainty. Okay, again, the extreme would be you can't at all. The other extreme would be that you can tolerate any kind of uncertainty, and then you've got the full sliding scale in between. Individualism, collectivism. So at one end, a society that is very much a collective mindset and a culture. It's the we, an individualistic society or culture, very much I. Yeah. I had a really interesting discussion actually with a cab driver from when I got my flight back from, we were in Northern Ireland at the weekend, as Janine mentioned. And so I had to get a taxi back from Bristol Airport to where I'd parked my car. And the taxi driver, the conversation started because he looked at me and he said to me, I would say that you're kind of Sudanese Ethiopian. I have this all the time. No one can tell where I'm from, okay? And I had to say, no, sorry, I'm not any of those things. And it turned out that he was Sudanese. And I was treated to a 20-minute lecture on my journey about the nature of Sudanese society. Okay. So I've learned that definitely if you are in the Sudan, you're living in a culture where there's quite a strong collective attitude. okay, rather than an individualistic attitude, okay. And then masculinity, femininity. So, you know, are you living in a society where attitudes tend more towards the kind of the macho, maybe slightly more aggressive? If you might object to that definition of masculinity, but that's what Hofstede, that's what he meant by masculinity, or more to the feminine end of the spectrum. Okay, so that's what he identifies. And actually, as time's gone on, and there's been more research, indulgence versus restraints and long-term orientation versus short-term orientation have been added to this. Okay. And this is something that people still use, and it was arrived at out of research conducted across 40 countries across the world. Okay. So I'm not, if you're interested in this, you can look it up, okay, because it is a lot, okay, and I'm not going to go through all of them, okay, but I've got slides here that show you some behavior examples, if you like, for societies or groups or countries or whatever, who tend towards either end of an extreme. Okay. So I've got, as you saw, there are 6 dimensions. I'm just going to look at a couple of them just so that we can think about where we position the UK. Yeah. And then maybe another country that you're familiar with and yourself. Okay. So I mean, if we look at this first example, you know, if you live in a country that has a small power distance, in other words, there's greater equality of power between all the members in that society, your attitude would be that use of power should be legitimate and is subject to criteria of good and evil. Okay. Whereas the other extreme is that power is a basic fact of society, antedating good or evil, and its legitimacy is irrelevant. Okay. You might also, in the small power distance society, feel that children should be treated as equals. Okay. Whereas in a larger power distance attitude, it would be that children are taught obedience. Okay. And just to look at one more, in the small power distance society, older people are neither respected nor feared. Where in the larger power distance, again, remember, it's that expectation of not being so equal, older people are both respected and feared. Okay, so I mean, I've just read out a few examples there, so it might be a bit unfair to ask you where you think you would position the UK in terms of large power distance, small power distance. You can either speak that out or put it into the chat if you think you've got a feeling about that. Okay. Any thoughts on where you think the UK would be?
I think I would position UK in small power distance, but I'm
Okay.
my country, to Poland, so yeah, that's why I have these 2 countries to compare. So I think UK, I would place UK like small power distance.
Okay, thank you, Kasia. So does that mean, what about Poland then? Would you put it at the other extreme, or?
A lot of things, yeah, probably closer to large power distance. Yeah,
Closer to large power distance.
I would agree with all mentioned, but yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And so in a way, you're answering my question, the next question, which is, what about you? You yourself. Okay, so are you closer to that Polish end, closer to the UK end? Where are you?
I'm closer to the Polish end.
Yeah, okay. And are you right at the Polish end, Kasia?
Probably with some things, yes. With something, I'm probably kind of like from time I live in this country, I have to say, I don't feel like I belong 100% to Poland or 100% to here, and I feel sometimes like I stand one leg in Poland, one in UK, different aspects. So it's just because moving here, I learn different point. I see things from different point of view. So, and I probably learn something. So, so it wouldn't be. But yeah, I think still more towards large power distance, because I live here 14 years and I lived in Poland 33 years.
Yeah. So it's going like that. Thank you, Kasha. It's a really valuable insight. Okay. So I'll just skip over the next one. That's about individualism versus collectivism. Let's think about uncertainty avoidance then. Okay, so it's how well a society can tolerate uncertainty and ambiguity. So how, if you can't tolerate it very well, then you might, I'm going to start at the bottom, in your religion and your philosophy and your science, you might believe in ultimate truths and grand theories, okay? Whereas if you can tolerate some uncertainty and ambiguity, you might be more relativist and empiricist in your attitude towards religion, philosophy, and science. Again, if you're not able to tolerate very well uncertainty and ambiguity, in the politics, citizens feel and are seen as incompetent towards authorities, whereas in a society that can tolerate it more, in politics, citizens feel and are seen as competent towards authorities. Okay. In a strong uncertainty avoidance culture, there's an emotional need for rules, even if they're not obeyed. Okay. Whereas in a weak uncertainty avoidance culture, there's a dislike of rules, written or unwritten. Okay. So again, just to dip in here, okay, because we could spend longer on it, but I'm not going to. You know, where would you put the UK? You know, would it be towards the strong uncertainty avoidance end where you don't really want uncertainty and ambiguity, or would it be to the weak uncertainty avoidance end where you can tolerate that? Any thought, Janine?
So this really kind of shows up in my relationship with my husband, who's Irish. And a lot of those are definitely so he dislikes rules. He is much happier with uncertainty. You know, it's kind of, that's how life is. And I'm nearer to strong uncertainty avoidance. I used to be very much in that, you know. I think being British, being Northern, my parents were quite old-fashioned, so I feel like definitely I had that kind of culture, and I'm shifting, I'm learning, I'm taking his you know, I'm seeing real positives in the weak uncertainty avoidance, and I'm moving more that way. So it just kind of, oh yeah, that's what it is between us. Yeah.
Thank you, Janine. Hold on to that thought. Okay. Thank you. Okay, so just going to look at one more. Let's try long-term orientation versus short-term orientation. Okay, and I think that's quite self-explanatory, isn't it? You know, if you're in a society or a culture that thinks long-term, you're going to think that you can look forwards, okay, and that you can prepare for the future, okay. Whereas if you're a short-term orientated culture, you place more emphasis on the past and perhaps believe the world hasn't changed much from the moment it was created, okay, and the past is what provides the blueprint for moral and social behavior. So if we look at some of the behaviors and attitudes, again, I'm just taking some randomly, in a short-term orientated culture, there are universal guidelines about what is good and what is evil, whereas in the long-term orientated one, what is good and evil depends upon the circumstances. Okay, it's a bit more relativist. In a short-term orientated culture, traditions are sacrosanct. In a more long-term one, traditions are adaptable to change circumstances. So I think you can see a theme there. In the long-term oriented attitudes are a bit more flexible, they move, okay. In a short-term oriented culture, family life is guided by imperatives, the things you have to do, the things that are expected. Okay. Whereas in a long-term oriented culture, family life is guided by shared tasks. So again, a hard question, but you know, where would you put the UK? Is it more towards the long term or more towards short term? What does anyone think? Anyone want to chip in here?
I kind of see it as more long term. I feel the UK has changed and moved forward, even though you can see elements of the short term orientation from where we've come. I just feel that we are listening to the people and the changes that are happening in society, and for individuals, and moving forward with that and giving people more scope to have that freedom with. That's what I think.
And is there thank you, Philomena. And is there another culture that you're quite familiar with that in your life?
In my culture,
Or yeah, or friends or relatives or yourself, your own heritage?
yeah. So my heritage is Italian, and I'd say it's quite. This is quite interesting because in Italy, I'd say that if you go more further south, you're going to have more the short-term thinking when it comes down to orientation. Whereas if you go up north, you have more long-term thinking. They're much more open to change. Whereas traditionally down south, they are quite set in their ways and like to have things continue in a very similar manner, and don't really take well to change or acceptance of change as well. That's just my personal experience. I don't that I'm voicing that with.
Yeah. So where would you position yourself?
For me, it's interesting. I mean, I would say I'm more long term. So I would position myself more in the way that we think here in the UK, and the more I prefer the fact that we have a lot more freedom in this country than you do in southern Italy. Even though I do respect and value the traditions that they have there and the importance of them, but I just think sometimes you just have to tweak it. Sometimes they don't want to just tweak it. So it's interesting. But the one thing that they will tweak, I will say, is the food. So the food is the only element of tweaking that they are happy with, and that just goes on whatever the mother does. So as a mother, you're able to tweak that to suit the family. That's the only thing I've discovered.
Thanks very much, Philomena. Thank you. And thank you for sharing what you're saying. And I think and I just wonder whether, considering those dimensions and considering some of the things that you've said about, you know, how you might be living in a culture that's positioned at one end or another end, but you yourself you're not necessarily at one end or another end yourself, and about that, you know, that interplay where perhaps you're in a relationship with somebody who from a different culture and attitudes and so on. You know, I wonder what that does for our understanding of some of the couples that we work with, really, and how what it is we'd be trying to support them to understand about one another. Okay. You know, I mean, I don't expect you to do this now. You could do this in your own time, you know, but you've already thought about it already. Some of your attitudes, where they come from, whether they align completely with one culture or another culture, or whether whether you're somewhere on that sliding scale. Okay. So again, we have to be careful about not making assumptions, even if we do know that people have these elements in their cultural story. I think what you were all saying loud and clear is that we still need to be curious about what it means for them, going back to "and that means" that we did at the beginning of the session. Okay. So, you know, so we need to ask, you know, what does that mean for you? And, you know, where do you position yourself, and what's that meaning for you? So if you're interested in Hofstede, you can go onto the website, because he even created maps to show where countries, how they measured up according to those dimensions. So you might be interested to see that. And you know, I saw here, this was in the Colin Largo book actually, he had an extract from one of those maps showing how countries were grouped according to power distance, which we looked at, and also uncertainty avoidance. And it's very interesting, you know, and it may help to foster your understanding of where someone else is coming from in their world view. Yeah. Even if it's not in their awareness. Yeah. I mean, as a British person myself, I find it interesting to see my country as a place where there is weak uncertainty avoidance and small power distance. But when I read the behaviour examples that we saw, given of those attributes, I recognise them, but they're not something that I think about all the time. Yeah. But the other thing that I reflect upon, and that you've shown me as well, is that there is a sliding scale for those attitudes on the individual level. Yeah. So although I might be living in a society which apparently is, according to one of the behaviour descriptions, 100% tolerant of deviant persons and ideas, deviant there isn't used in a pejorative way. It means sort of just deviating from the norm. Am I 100% tolerant of that, or only 25%? And what might help me to understand the answer to that? Okay. So it's that digging underneath, isn't it? Digging under that waterline. If we want to understand about diversity, we need to understand about attitudes and where they've come from, and what people's relationship is with those attitudes. You know, it goes back, doesn't it, as well, to that thing about the domain of production, domain of explanation, giving people the chance to tell their story and where they are within that, so then we can have a greater understanding. You know, would that make a difference to me, for example, in working with the family I told you about, whether mum was throwing shoes at the child? You know, if I know that her country of origin was a society where children had to obey all the time and punishment of children is okay, as I say, it's not going to negate my statutory obligations here in the UK, but it might help me to have a more helpful conversation with her. Okay, to understand, okay, so this is what happens. And where are you? Are you totally aligned with that attitude? And now that you're here, what do you think? And, you know, how do you navigate that? So I hope that kind of makes some sense. We are due a break. I timed it for midday, but we're a bit ahead. So I just wonder if anyone's got any questions on that last bit, because it can feel a bit confusing, a bit complicated maybe. Is there anything that anybody wants to ask? I don't know, Beth, whether there are any questions in the chat.
No, nothing in the chat, Michelle.
Thanks, Beth. Is there anything for anyone? Do you feel okay with that? Or do you feel bamboozled?
I mean, it's a lot to take in, it's a lot to consider. And this, for me, is the first time I've come across this in that much detail. So, but I don't have any questions. It's just really good. So
Thanks,
much
Philomena.
food for thought.
Yeah, I think so. Well, maybe over a cup of tea then, if there aren't any other questions. So should we break now? Okay, so I think it's about 5 to 12. So should we break now till 10 past? Does that feel okay for everybody? Yeah.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank
Okay,
you.
see you at 10 past. Okay. Thank you. Well, welcome back, everyone. And I think, you know, this visual, if you like, is it was kind of inviting people, those of you who were at the NTE, you know, to think about how we now put ourselves in the picture, which I think we've been doing quite a lot of anyway across this morning. Because you know, I think you've had some really good reflections, actually, just thinking about, you know, what we each bring, but also the impacts we have on other people and the impact that other people have on us. Okay, so you know, what happens in that relational space when when we're all bringing the stuff that we bring. And I think something else that you've all said, you know, of course, is that our identities aren't fixed. Yeah, that they will fluctuate according to circumstances, experiences, and relationships. And we said this too, didn't we? That we may be one thing in one context and something quite different in another. You know, my husband's always saying to me, "Do the people you work with, do they know what you're really like?" So yes, is that a threat or a promise? You know, but we're not going to be the same everywhere. And you know, and again, if you think about that reflection you did on times when you felt different, you know, and how there are times when you don't. Okay, so we're not fixed. You know, being in relationship with others isn't fixed, is it? Yeah, it's a dynamic, always moving flux. And in that flux, we're constantly changing position, changing who is leading, maybe, you know, depending on what it is you're trying to do, and so on. It's just like this couple that we're looking at here, that's from Strictly, that picture. And, you know, they're always going to be thinking, you know, what and where next as they move around that dance floor, aren't they? What these two know in this context is who will be leading and who will be following. Yeah. If that's never changing, what impact might it have on how each partner sees themselves? Okay, if you know that you're never going to be leading, or you know that you're always going to be leading, what impact does it have? As well as knowing ourselves, we need to build an awareness of how the people we work with might be positioned by who we are in relation to them. And I suppose that's in my story of feeling different, where you know, I'm kind of behind in the news, that I'm someone else in some people's eyes compared to the person I see myself as. But that person might feel positioned by me just because of the role I have in marriage care. Do you know what I mean? In relation to them. So it might not be my attention, it might not even be in my awareness. But, you know, in that example, my job title means that people might feel positioned. Yeah, even and we might feel positioned in other ways too. When I deliver this training, you know, and I've delivered it to lots of people now, you know, there are times when people will say, "Oh, that was a lot, Michelle," you know, or "less is more." I remember getting some feedback like that from the NTE. And I think, you know, an aspect of my identity is that I am fairly well educated, you know, that I'm fairly academic, I suppose. And so I've lost the knack maybe sometimes of thinking what it might be like not to have access to that particular language that I have access to. Yeah. So it's not that I go around feeling better than other people because I've maybe had some more education than some people. But what it does mean is that there are things that I never have to deal with or negotiate. There are some things that I don't experience as obstacles that other people might. Okay. And that's what's meant by invisible privilege. Okay. It's not, I think people, again, it's a term that people can feel quite sensitive about, because we feel like we're nice people, and when people start talking about how we're privileged, it makes us feel like they're telling us we're racist, we're nasty people, and that sort of thing. But it isn't that. It's about building in a bit of an awareness of where it might be, what might be the areas in which you do enjoy a privilege, and where maybe having an awareness that that might not be the case for others that we are relating to and working with. So have an awareness of where that might not be the same for them. And sometimes that privilege, like as in this slide, if it never moves, then it's going to mean that some people are always positioned one down, isn't it? Okay, so it's when it becomes systems and institutions and everything that it becomes a problem. You know, if we think back to those social graces, there are many aspects of identity that can be positioned as empowered or as powerless. Okay. So, you know, when we think about this slide, they know who's leading. But what would happen then if we decided that the person with the longest hair should have a go at leading? Yeah. Or if it were decided on Strictly, I don't know if you're Strictly fans, I am. Okay. But if it were decided that, you know, every season in Strictly, they have a person who has some sort of physical challenge as a competitor, what would it be like if actually everybody who had all the contestants were people with physical challenges, and there was one able-bodied contestant. Okay, because in other words, you know, that there's inclusion, yeah, but the inclusion is decided by the people who have the privilege. Okay, and so their interpretation of inclusion is, let's invite in someone who is an amputee, let's invite in someone who is deaf, rather than it being that we're working within that and we're seeing everybody as who they are, and we're not we're perhaps being a bit tokenistic, to use a word that you don't hear very often, in deciding that, well, yeah, okay, we'll fulfill our duty by having this one person. Yeah. So I hope the example I'm giving is a good way to imagine how privilege could stay rigid or how it may flex, and to notice how our identities, our intersectionalities that we talked about, are not just an inner concept, but that they relate and respond and shapeshift according to context. Yeah. So, I mean, if we think back to Hofstede a moment, you know, and those attitudes, you know, I mean, just a question for you to just ponder to yourself, you know, is whether there are qualities and attributes and attitudes that have tended to be in a position of dominance, that have been privileged, that are seen as okay attitudes, yeah, and others that are seen as not okay attitudes. And what might that contribute to the way in which the groups that have the not okay attitudes might regard themselves? Yeah. And what does it do to the way that we, if we're in a group that we think have the okay attitudes, what does it do to the way we regard those other groups? Yeah. I read a novel, I recommended it at the conference weekend, called The Vanishing Half by Britt Bennett. I don't know if any of you have read it. I know quite a few people bought it on the weekends. And what I found really interesting, because it's about, I don't want to give too much away in case you do read it, but there are twin sisters in this novel. But they're of mixed race, and they look quite different. And one of them, I think they're of mixed race anyway, but for whatever reason, one of them is lighter skinned than her sister. Okay. And it's set in America in an era where it wasn't easy to be black or brown, or well, I say it as if that era has gone, but it was even harder, let's put it that way, okay, to be black or brown. But in that era, if you were pale enough, you could do something called pass. Has anyone come across that idea?
Yeah.
And I found, when I read the novel, it wasn't an idea that I'd really taken on board. And when I read it, I was kind of really struck by the idea of being in a society where, you know, it's not just about black and white, but it's also about less black and more black. Okay, what that means. Okay, and so the sister who could pass, her life was so completely different from the sister who couldn't. Okay. So yeah, so even within that group, and even within their town where they lived, they were regarded differently because of their skin tone. They were actually regarded differently anyway. Yeah, so, and it's really interesting novel because we read about how that experience is internalized by the sister who couldn't pass. And we also read about the internal experience of the sister who could, you know, so I really recommend it.
Were they Asian? Were they Asian?
No, they weren't. They were of African heritage. Negro
Because the Asians are very much into darker and lighter.
Yes.
So can you remind the title of the
Yes,
novel?
it's called, yes, Kasia, it's called The Vanishing Half. The Vanishing Half. Yeah. So if I hold it up, but it's back to front, isn't it? It looks like that though. And it's by Britt Bennett. Okay.
I have to say, I experienced a similar situation. Years ago, I've been on holidays to Dominican Republic, and we went on an organized trip, and that guide in actually TUI, that was organized by TUI, so he should kind of follow some rules, but he was talking about people from Haiti, that they are much darker, and he was talking in very negative, I would say, racist way about them, and it really shocked me because yes, people from Haiti are a bit darker but I couldn't understand it really. It really shocked me.
Yes, yes.
Yes, of course, the countries that colonized this part of the island probably were different, so that probably that's why there was a bit of difference in color. But
Yes.
For me, it was shocking.
Yes, yes, yes. Thank you. Yeah, that must have been a jolt for you. I can feel it was a jolt.
Mm.
Yes. Yes, I mean, I said, I said to you that maybe sometimes I've taken for granted, my education. But when I went to university, I grew up in the East End of London, okay, and I am who I am. You see me, me. I went to university, and it was a university, especially then, that was really dominated by white middle class students. And it was my first experience, actually, and maybe this goes back to what we were saying about feeling different. I have to say, first of all, that I did absolutely love my time at university. But it was my first experience of meeting people who you'd met them and you'd spoken to them one day. And then the next time you saw them, they would walk straight past you as though they'd never met you. And I think what was going on was that I didn't fit. Yeah. And that they had, some of these people had a kind of an understanding that came from their social position, if you like, and social status. They probably didn't think about it. They probably weren't thinking consciously, right, we're going to upset Michelle by ignoring her. But they just had this kind of privilege of understanding how they operated. And I didn't have that understanding of how they operated, because where I grew up, if you knew someone, you always said hello to them. We just knew what the kind of social ways were. I suppose so was there an impediment for me in that situation? Well, not so much. I think it was more a feeling different and maybe a bit misunderstood and a bit perplexed myself, not understanding what was happening, I suppose. So maybe it's not such a good example. But I just sort of imagine, when I imagine those students, that they weren't aware. They weren't aware that they had something that meant that they were positioned such that they could behave like that, which would mean that others weren't seen by them or could feel unseen by them. I don't know, we struggle to explain what we mean, but luckily I've got some help this morning, because I've got a couple of videos here, two people who I think put the experience of and the meaning of privilege really, really well, better than I can. So the first person you're going to hear is John Amaechi, who was a basketball player. And the second person you're going to hear is Rose Ayling-Ellis, who, did anyone, if any of you are Strictly fans, she's the deaf actress who's in EastEnders. I think she was in EastEnders. I think it was EastEnders. And she was a contestant in Strictly, and she talks about her life. Okay. And there'll be some questions that I'd ask you to consider after you've seen the videos. So to do this, I've got to stop the share so that I can take you to the link to show them to you. So I'm just going to show them back to back. Okay. So just bear with me a moment. So everything looks a bit different for you right now while I just do this. Okay, hopefully you can now see him. Can you see John Amaechi on privilege?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'll try and make it a bit bigger and hope it doesn't affect the sound.
Thought that you were profound and eloquent in a way that I hadn't heard expressed on the subject of privilege. It was very much gentle and reaching across the aisle. So without insulting the aggrieved here in America, who feel like they have every right in the world to be aggrieved, what do you mean when you say that when you come from a position of privilege, sometimes you don't notice some of the things happening around you until they're storming the Capitol with weaponry that leaves somebody dead in the hallway?
Yeah, I think privilege is about the absence of an impediment. For the first thing to say is this: every single person believes in some kind of privilege. Everybody understands the privilege for example, of being a native speaker in a country. So whether you're American going to somewhere in Europe or British going somewhere in Europe, you understand the advantage of being a speaker of that language. You understand the advantage, the privilege of being born in a wealthy family versus a poor one, going to a private or independent school versus going to a comprehensive or state school. We know about these privileges and we understand them. We understand that they provide an advantage, but when you're in them, I went to a grammar school in this country. That's not a comprehensive school, not a state school. It's a slightly better fee-paying school where I got a bursary. And I took for granted that that's what school was. It never occurred to me that other people went to schools where they just didn't learn stuff, where there was chaos, where there were teachers who were disengaged. That's an advantage I took my entire life through without even considering until I got to witness what other people's schooling experience was like. The problem we have is that oftentimes privilege ends with race and gender. As a man, as men, we have huge privilege. Huge privilege. I didn't really think about this. There's a woman who did a Twitter feed, and I'll find it and post it on my Twitter feed after this. But she did this question. She asked women, what would you do if men had a curfew after 9 o'clock? And that's the thing that taught me about male privilege. And that's the thing that taught me about male privilege, because I watched the responses from women across the world, and they were so mundane, Dan. They were so ordinary. I'd walk with both my headphones in. I'd run at night. I'd leave my drink at the bar. I'd watch the stars. This is stuff I'd never considered that I couldn't do. That the absence of that impediment had never occurred to me because I'd never asked a woman what her experience was like. And when it comes to Blackness, I'm a psychologist. I'm a 50-year-old psychologist. I live in a penthouse in Covent Garden. I don't know what the American or Miami equivalent, maybe your house, equivalent of that is, but it's doing all right. And I get stopped and searched 3 times a year. A man in a uniform, in a police uniform, holds me by my arm. And the last time it happened, I was wearing a 3-piece suit. And outside of Leicester Square tube station, a man who looked 12 to me, a police officer who looked 12 to me, held me by the arm, looked me in the face, and told me that I resembled the description. I was wearing a 3-piece suit. I am 6'9" and I have a bushy white beard. I'm genuinely interested to know the doppelganger that I have in London. And I'm aware it's a big city. The reason I say this is because this happens to me 3 times a year. It hasn't happened in 2020. I just want to be absolutely full disclosure. And that's because the solution to not being stopped and searched in the street for me as a large Black person is to never leave my house. Most white people have never considered that it could happen. I watch in the before times when there were tourists here in central London, and white people would come up and they would walk up to a police officer who was not facing in their direction. And I would watch incredulous as they approach a police officer from behind and then touch them, tap them on the shoulder, and they would turn around. They would see their faces, their white faces, and they would smile and they would get direction somewhere. And I would watch this enraptured because I am not a lawbreaker. I am unbelievably boring. But I'm terrified of the police because I know how humiliating it is to be held by the arm by a man who looks 12. If you've never considered this, that's a privilege. You never considered the possibility. Every lift, every elevator I get in, I know where everybody's wallet is. Because men in lifts with me, they put their hands on their wallet, on the jacket pocket. Women take their bags from the shoulder closest to me and put it on the shoulder furthest away. And this is happening to me, a psychologist. What is so scary? And it's happening in a lift. And let's face it, I am old and I'm a bit decrepit. But if I'm trapped in a 5 foot by 5 foot box with you going up 40 floors, if I want your wallet, I'm having your wallet. But this is the stuff that people don't consider, and it may seem inconsequential to you, but it doesn't happen once. Every day I walk outside in public, I know that I'm a monster. Because that's how people respond to me. They don't look at me and think there's that clever guy who's got a bit of a fixation with Star Wars. No, they don't think that. They cross the street. That tells you something about yourself that's horrible. And as a white person, you've probably not had that. And it doesn't mean you've never had an interaction with the police. It just means your interaction with the police isn't because of the color of your skin. Privilege is not, it doesn't mean unearned riches. I know that some of the people who are listening to this show right now, they've got nothing like the wealth privilege I have, nothing like the education privilege that I have. I am a deeply, deeply privileged person, and I admit that every single day. And you know what happens when I do that? Absolutely nothing, except for the fact that I am slightly better at interacting with people without privilege. I am slightly more inquisitive about understanding the ways that I am not impeded, that other people are.
And if you could just say your name, it'd be great.
Robert Brown. I'm a simple civil captain at British.
Okay, let me just stop that share. Can I just check, because Kasha, I saw your message. You couldn't see the video. Could everyone else see the video? You couldn't see it?
No, it wasn't from me. I didn't type in a message.
No, it was from me.
Oh, Janine, I'm sorry.
So I could hear him, and that was fine, but the video didn't play.
Oh, that's strange. Did everyone else?
Yes, no, it didn't. It was just a picture.
It was the picture of the start of it, but it wasn't. He wasn't talking. You could just hear.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize because it was playing for me, so I didn't see that it wasn't playing for you. Did you feel that you?
Yes, no, we could hear it.
What he said.
At least I could hear it perfectly well, but I couldn't. It didn't appear to be the person that was speaking.
Okay, that's really bizarre. I'm so sorry. I don't know. Well, I've got another video now, which I want to show you as well. Can you let me know if the same thing happens? Okay, and then I'll stop it. Okay. Let me just get it up and then just share the page. That's really strange. Okay. Right, so just let me know, okay, if the same thing happens. And you do need to look at the subtitles on this one, okay? So it will be important that it plays properly.
I know how important the support of my deaf friend are to me.
Yep, that's fine.
Good.
I love standing. I find this so relaxing. It's not tiring. I'm not worried about missing anything. I was loving.
Okay, so just stop that share. Okay, so that was an extract from a program that Rose Ellis did about wanting people to learn sign language. Okay. So I think what's interesting in listening to John Amaechi and to Rose is that idea of well, and you know, seeing what her friends were saying in the pub as well, was thinking about privilege as something that people are having to overcome, and that we have privilege if we don't have to do that. Okay, so if we don't have to worry about being stopped by the police because of the color of our skin, if we don't have to endure sorry, I'm just trying to work out how to share this now. If we don't have to endure only knowing part of a conversation because others can't share it with us, that's a privilege. I think that's the point. Okay, I'm just trying to share this again. Sorry, I need to come out so I can do it. So just bear with me one moment so I can just go back into the slides and then show you, because there are some things now that I'd like you to reflect on in the light of those two videos. So let me just bring it back up the way I need to see it. Okay, so can you now see a slide saying self-reflection? Yeah. So I just would like you to, and we're going to go back into, well, we could do this in a breakout room, like the four of you, like we did before, Beth. To just think about how those two people impacted you, how you are impacted by others, how are others impacted by you, and what absence of impediment do you enjoy? Okay, so we're going to give you now. I'm slightly behind time now for some reason, but this will probably take us to one actually, if that's okay. But we will be finishing almost immediately after that. Those of you who are concerned about getting away. So I hope that's okay. So yeah, as before, if you want to just jot down those questions, take a photo, and we'll pop you into a group so you can discuss it without me and Beth listening to you. And Beth, when you're ready, send everybody off. So yeah, we're back at 1. Okay. Okay. So just briefly, you know, I wonder how you found that to reflect on. I'm conscious that it was quite a lot to think about, even in 20 minutes. Could you even begin? Could you begin on how you impact others or how you impacted by others? Anyone want to say anything just briefly? But again, as always, you don't have to.
I think we had too many things going on for us to really focus on what I understand these questions are about, but that just could be me. So it feels like there's been so much this morning that we need space to really think about it and think about ourselves.
Yeah, yes, and that's so good. It's, you know, you'll have the slides after this as usual, so you'll have the questions and you can give it some more thoughts and you can journal it and that kind of thing. I mean, this very much is the beginning of reflection and conversations about this. You know, there's no such thing as looking at this and it being wrapped up. Okay, even when you've spent a whole morning on it. Okay, so I hope you'll find it useful in your further explorations and further conversations. So, and I am going to wrap up now, you know, so, you know, that question that was flashed up at the beginning was, can we work with people who are different from ourselves? And I think that the answer to that question is yes. Yeah, we can. And there may even be occasions when it's preferable that we don't know too much, because the curiosity that we need to bring to those interactions can provide fruitful opportunities for reflection for the people that we're seeking to support as well. Okay, our curiosity may help them to think, oh, do you know, I've not thought about that before, and this is something that's helpful to explore. And so, I mean, sometimes it will depend on the preferences of the person we're working with. Okay, so for example, I know that there are LGBTQ plus people who prefer to work with therapists who identify similarly. But then I've known others who either have no preference or who have deliberately sought out a straight therapist. Yeah, so it just depends, doesn't it? And I recently heard a Black British man in an interview talking about this very thing, and he said that he was happy to work with a white therapist as long as that therapist was culturally competent in the ways that we've been exploring this morning. Yeah. And you know, and it's still the case that many of these of the kind of minoritized groups that we might think of when we're thinking about diversity are really poorly represented in therapy world. So if we did arrive at a conclusion to think, oh, well, we think it's best if people work with people like themselves, in inverted commas, we know that that's a dangerous assumption now, don't we? You know, what we might be saying is that they can't access help. Okay, so we have to engage with this really. Yeah. And as I said earlier, you know, whenever we're sitting with another person, we are having a cross-cultural experience, whoever that person is. There's danger inherent in thinking that someone is the same as us. If we're to be of use, then curiosity should always be present. So, you know, my slide here, what do you mean? I think that curiosity of, well, what do you mean and what does that mean to you? To keep asking that and not to think we know that. Okay, it's really important. So some top tips, I think things that we've mentioned this morning anyway, thickening the narrative, okay, and what does that mean? And what does that mean? And what does that mean? Yeah. Remembering the social graces, in other words, that we don't just have this linear view and a narrow view of what we mean by diversity, which I think we can come from, at all those aspects of identity. Think about cultural competence, yeah, about that yes, knowledge, yeah, curiosity, and also self-knowledge. I think we saw illustrated quite well that dynamic interplay between personality and culture, and that's why we have to keep being curious. Yeah, as you all showed, you know, when we looked at those attitudes, the spectrum of attitudes, nobody was at one end or the other end, even if the country was located at one end or another end. So you're in it, you're in the mix. That the last bit there, pathways to deeper understanding, I've put here cultural genograms and that model for exploring what people might bring with them. They might be things that support conversations. I haven't demonstrated them here to this morning particularly, because believe it or not, I did actually cut this down quite significantly. Okay, so there might be a separate training to come on working with inter-heritage couples. So I don't know if we are at the end. I think I'd just like to go around and just quickly ask you what your top takeaway is from this morning, okay? Whatever that is. Can I start with Philomena? Do you want to give us your top takeaway?
Oh gosh. I think my top takeaway is this is really, really, you know, when you're aware of something, that this has really opened my eyes to just how many different layers there really are. And that's something to really dig deeper into and to never assume, and it's okay to ask. I think that's what I'm going to come away with. So thank you very much, Michelle.
Thank you, Philomena. Thank you for that, because actually, you know, when you give me your top takeaways, I use them too. This is CPD for me as well. You're all providing, okay? So thank you, Philomena. Janine, how about for you?
That this working within diversity is a lifelong thing. It's not, you don't go on a course and do it. It's working on yourself all the time. That's, yeah.
Yeah, thanks very much, Janine. Thank you. Wise words. And Penny? Are you still with us, Penny? Because I know she needed to go. Has Penny gone, Beth? I can't see her on my screen.
I can't see her.
Okay. I say, so thank you, the hardcore people that are still here at the end. Kasia, how about for you? A top takeaway for you?
I think that it's understanding that we can work with anybody as far as we are open, curious, and respectful, and also understanding that actually we all are different, even if we are from the same country, speak the same language. In theory, we shouldn't assume we have the same background, because we all are different. So to be honest, we should have the same approach, always the same approach.
Thank you, Kasia. Thank you. And I think, you know, a final reflection for me, I mean, you know, and really it touches on what Janine said, you know, that this is a beginning. And I think to be meeting just to talk, you could probably have a good hour and a half discussion just based on one of the things we've talked about today. Okay, I know Janine tried to start something for this very purpose, and I still think it's a valuable idea. You know, on this and maybe on some other aspects too, that just some talking groups sometimes, just have a chat, and that is also CPD, even if you haven't got someone showing you a PowerPoint. So I think I'd love to think that we might have sown some seeds for that this morning. Okay. But thank you so much for listening and participating. You didn't just listen. I just on here, I've just got some of the resources that I dipped into in preparing this, but also one or two things that I haven't spoken about this morning, but that you might find useful references if you wanted to find out more. And it's great if you can share things that you found useful too, okay, that perhaps are not on this list. But it's lovely to see you all and to connect, as people have said. Thank you for lasting out, even though maybe we're not all feeling great and we're feeling busy and all those sorts of things. But thank you, and I look forward to seeing you all probably in the not too distant future for some other reason.
Mm.
All right.
Thank you.
All right. You're
Okay.
welcome. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, recording stopped.
Yep, just about to.